Hello, and welcome to Ask Tell number 14. I'm Adam Kadri. So, when I first started this show, I had no idea how long each installment was going to be, but the first few ended up landing between 50 and 60 minutes, so I decided to stick with that, at least as long as I could. Well, this one wound up clocking in at close to 2 hours. And that's easy to fix. Just split it in half, and you get 2 episodes of the proper length. But in this case, there's no way to do that without cutting one of the segments into 2 pieces, so that's what we're going to do. Ask Tell number 14 will cover the first hour or so of our segment on The Baron, and then number 15 will finish up The Baron and move on to Delightful Wallpaper. So away we go. First up, we have The Baron by Victor Gijsbers, a philosophy professor in the Netherlands. He has his own set of videos about interactive fiction. The first couple of them are about my own game, 905, and they took a deep dive into the philosophical underpinnings of that little game, and of narrative in general. I don't know that I have the intellectual heft to do the same for his game, but hey, that's why I bring on guests. They supply the intellectual heft, and I supply the snacks. That's a joke. They don't get snacks. So, here to talk with me about The Baron is a new guest, Rachel K. Jones. Let's meet Rachel.
My name's Rachel K. Jones, and I'm an award-nominated short story author and editor of speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I have way too many published stories to list them all. I've got about 100 in publication right now. But if people are interested in looking at some of my work, I wrote a story called The Night Bazaar for Women Becoming Reptiles, which appeared in an anthology called Dispatches from Anaras, which is a bunch of stories written in tribute to Ursula K. Le Guin. If you want to find more of my work, just check out my website, www.rachelkjones.com, and you can find my full bibliography there.
So when I started this show back in 2015, I thought, hey, a podcast about interactive fiction. Kind of a niche subject, but at least there won't be too many other folks staking out the same ground. And it turns out that there are actually so many that I snagged you from a different IF podcast that I ran across on Twitter back in the pre-Elon era. The before times. So how did you first encounter interactive fiction?
I was born a little too late to be part of the big Infocom wave back in the 80s. But what I did have was a very old floppy disk from some bargain bin in the 90s that had like the best of Infocom. And it was how I learned how to type. So back when I was a kid, like computers were starting to be a thing in the home. And I would spend hours and hours and hours playing with these old games and finger pecking on the keyboard until I learned how to type. And then by the time I was in college, I started looking for more. And that was around the time that I know a lot of interactive fiction hobbyist work was really starting to hit the internet. So I would go and download games from like the IF comps and play some of those. And I was really enchanted with all of the narrative games, especially. For me as a writer, even though I don't write interactive fiction myself, I remember learning a lot of the principles of what would become some of my own style as a short story author from interactive fiction. How you hide a surprise in plain sight, and how you give people a feeling of a big payoff at the end of the story, because I think that's something that interactive fiction does really well. And since then, I am the kind of interactive fiction player who forgets about the entire genre for years at a time, and then suddenly will one day wake up and then run around and download all the games I can find, and I play them obsessively for a couple of months and then forget about it again. So I'm kind of a fair weather friend, but it's really lovely to be here and talking with someone who designed some of those games that really inspired me.
Glad to have you. Thanks for coming on, and let's dive in. What do we have here?
The Baron is by an author named Victor Gijsbers, and it's about a man on a quest to rescue his 12-year-old daughter who's been kidnapped by an evil baron. And over the course of the game, it's revealed that the father is molesting his daughter, and he's actually the same person as the baron that he's trying to go slay. And it ends up being a metaphor for his internal conflicts as he's debating whether to continue his cycle of abuse. The game's structured in a series of 3 encounters that this main character has on his way to the Baron's castle. First, he's attacked by a she-wolf. Then he has a conversation with the gargoyle. And then finally, there's a conversation with the Baron himself. each of these conversations gives you a multiple choice dialogue menu with around 3 to 5 major threads that you can follow and explore different sorts of character types through that play. And then there's also some optional small puzzles that you can find while exploring the father's house and the Baron's castle that give you more context to the backstory about what's going on in the story.
So part of the idea behind this show is that I stopped playing interactive fiction pretty much immediately following the 2001 competition, and I'm now trying to get caught up. But I did play most of what came out in the few years before that, and the Baron reminded me a lot of a game from the 1999 comp called Bliss by Cameron Wilkin. In Bliss, you're told that you're a knight about to take on a dragon, but that turns out not to be real, but rather the delusion of a maniac who's escaping from an asylum and going on a killing spree. The Baron also starts with you as a knight about to take on a dragon, and it also turns out that that's not real. And then you wake up, but most of what you wake up to turns out not to be real either.
Like the whole misdirect story type. And the story is very much a critique of this black and white power fantasy of a knight fighting a dragon, good versus evil, the righteous father on a quest to save his daughter. And it's interesting to me because it's using as its material all of these toxic beliefs about the nature of men, that, men are violent, men struggle with instinct, they're inclined towards their instinct and towards violence, and they're prisoners to these in ways that maybe women are not. And I liked how the game uses this motif to basically show how the main character can deny his own agency and the abuse he's inflicting on his daughter.
So yeah, that's one of the big differences between this and Bliss. Bliss did have a long scene from the maniac's traumatic childhood, but no one was going to call it a serious look into the psychology of the criminally insane. But the Baron does seem to want to be taken seriously as an examination of the mind of a child rapist. So how do you think it did on that score?
Any writer out there who's interested in writing about socially conscious topics and writing about big issues, at some point in your career, you're going to attempt a story like this. A story on a topic that you find difficult and is hard to engage with and just has lots and lots of layers to it of, life experiences that you don't share, but usually it's something you care a lot about. And what's difficult about this is that oftentimes we try these stories before we have the skills to pull them off. And I think it's common. I think that, we write from places of a lot of passion. And so that's why we'll take on stories like this. And so the problem is that what I learned over time for myself, because I've written stories like this too, is that portraying something is not the same thing as critiquing of it. And if you're not careful, you can unintentionally romanticize something or even normalize something that you're trying to critique. And it's not what you want to do. It's never the author's intention when you set out to write a story like even The Baron to do that. But it's just a matter of skill and experience and craft, whether you can pull it off correctly. So one problem that you can run into when you do that is that you may end up giving less agency to the same group of people that maybe you're trying to speak up for. One example that always drove me crazy is Mad Men, because it was all about the sexist ad agency culture of the 60s. And it would do this thing repeatedly where it would show men being horrible and sexist and degrading to one of the female characters. And then the camera would cut to the woman looking all sad and wallowing in her feelings. And the episode would fade to black and end. And then it would happen over and over and over again. You just have episode after episode where this was sort of a pattern. And I would believe with all of my heart that the people who wrote this were trying to advocate for these women and show how hard life was for them. And just look at how horrible sexual harassment is, what it looks like and how it can hurt people. But for me, every time I'd see that, I'd be like, you haven't really told me anything new. Because if I wanted to know what sexual harassment looks like, I would just step outside and take a walk somewhere. And so it's not really a shocking plot twist to me as a woman that sexual harassment exists and that it's a thing out there in the world. And even worse to me is that the problem is just portraying something to critique it just keeps that camera focused right on the perpetrator rather than the victim. You get the feelings of these men who are doing these horrible things to these women, but you miss out on the agency and the humanity of the women who are, getting harassed, and the fact that they would do more than just look sad. And so I kind of had that same critique here at The Baron that ultimately I think that It's trying to deconstruct this horrible child molester character, but ultimately it takes all the agency away from the daughter and, like, at one point makes her into a literal doll. And so she's just more of an object than she ever was if you weren't in this guy's head.
I certainly see echoes of a lot of my early IF work here, and specifically my attempts to take on this theme, which I was not really equipped to handle. A little bit of personal backstory. Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov was actually the book that got me interested in pursuing literature in college rather than chemistry or astronomy or other subjects I'd been considering. It was actually one of two factors that nudged me in that direction. The first was that I did an international baccalaureate diploma, and when I got my scores back, my English scores were higher than my other scores, which came as some surprise because I went to a tech magnet school. I was driving past 10 other high schools to get to this magnet school because of its computer science program. And now everything is telling me like, yes, literary study, that's your wheelhouse. But then I read Lolita at the very end of my senior year of high school.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah, I was like, I didn't know novels could be like this. Maybe I should study literature. So I did. And one of the novels in my senior seminar was by Jeff Ryman, which became my favorite prose novel, in large part because it is the single best treatment that I have ever read about the devastation of child sexual abuse. And then toward the end of the decade, late 90s, I watched the movie The Sweet Hereafter, which became my favorite movie for about 5 years there. I still love it, but it was definitely my favorite movie around the time I was writing IF. And a big plot thread in that movie, and the book it was an adaptation of, is that you have an immensely lovable teenage girl who we discover has been groomed into a sexual relationship by her father. And I found all these stories so moving and so heartbreaking. And I thought, I want to help.
I know.
I also want to write stories to open people's eyes to this scourge. So you see these threads in Varicella. You see them in Shrapnel in particular, which is very clearly echoed by the Baron. Shrapnel also has the player character's personality split to externalize the abuser, just like in the Baron. But I was a dweeb in my early 20s. Pretty much my entire understanding of the topic came from these books and movies that I mentioned. So I couldn't really pull it off the way I wanted to.
You cannot see my face right now, but I'm so sympathetic. I really understand. I mean, I think it just takes time and experience. I don't think it's wasted to make those attempts before your skill's at the right level. Like, I think that writers have to reach a little higher than you're ready for in order to know what you still need to work on. It all adds up over time. But it is interesting how over time your perspective of how to tell those stories changes as maybe you just gain more life experience. And you're right, maybe you have experiences or maybe you make friends with people who've like actually lived those stories, and you kind of start to understand the difference between what you've seen in the other media you've consumed versus how to tell the story from a new, fresh place that is a little bit less 101. I'm even thinking of it. There's a friend of mine who wrote a really terrific children's novel called A Game of Fox and Squirrels. Her name's Jen Reese, and the book won a bunch of children's awards for the age group that it was in a couple years back. And it's a story about some children who are put in foster care because their dad physically abuses them. And it's a story about what happens immediately after they enter foster care. And I remember her telling me about the story is that years and years ago, when she was younger, she would have written this story about the abuse itself instead of about the fallout of the abuse. And that really struck me as sort of a difference in how time and experience can change the way you approach these difficult stories in ways that produce stories that are interesting, that give the characters agency. The difficult topics where you were cutting your teeth when you were first starting out in your 20s. I'm kind of curious, if you were to retell those stories today, would you still want to tell those kinds of stories? Like, would you approach them differently, or would you not tell those at all?
That's an interesting question, especially given that a few years ago, I did revisit not my IF stories, but my novel. I rewrote the whole thing from scratch. And you were just talking about meeting people who had certain experiences, and that's really the difference between the two editions. The first edition, the hardcover, was full of characters who were basically just collections of eccentricities. And then, over the course of the intervening 15 years, I actually became close to people who had enough overlap of experiences and personalities that I could say, oh, so this is what a real life version of this character would actually be like. Let me use that to inform the rewrite. And the characters in the second edition are immeasurably better because of that. But that's slightly different from what you're asking. It's about character rather than theme, so let me give you an actual answer. Nowadays, I would ask, and I do ask, do I actually have anything to contribute to the conversation around this theme? Am I drawing on my own life experience, now that I have some? Because that is my story to tell. Or do I have some ideas that I want to get out there that I haven't heard articulated in this exact way? Or is this a case where I need to hang back and let better informed voices take the floor?
Write what you know.
Yeah, and even beyond write what you know, I'd add this. Pretty much any kind of storytelling is going to involve some amount of shapeshifting. Obviously, you don't want every character to be a perfect clone of yourself. So what do you do if you're writing someone who doesn't share your subject position? You can make stuff up and hope for the best. You can draw upon your own experience anyway and hope it still rings true. Or you can draw upon others. And that's totally legit. You really couldn't tell stories if it weren't. But it is secondhand content. And sometimes you should cede the floor to someone for whom it's firsthand content. This is a weird example, but I once wrote an article about that Louis C.K. movie. The movie was called I Love You, Daddy, in which a bunch of women give speeches about how when they were younger, they were all dying to jump on older men, and society needs to get over its hang-ups about that. And when I say a bunch of women, I mean these speeches are given by imaginary women made up by the middle-aged men who wrote this movie.
Yes.
And yeah, there are 4 billion women in the world, and it's entirely possible that these male writers could say, hey, I was just quoting some women I know who said things like this to me. But even if that is the case, maybe this is one of those cases where you step back and let one of them make the movie?
Yes, especially if it's uniquely about something that only women experience or women experience much more so than men. Yes. The other option that authors have is to have enough other friends, authors, or otherwise who will read your stuff and give you really, really honest feedback on how you did on a particular metric. So if you're a man trying to write women, or you're a white person trying to write people of color, it's 100% contingent on how good your relationship is with the person you're asking advice for. Because in my experience, nothing is worse than going through the work of reading something, giving your absolute honest advice on something that's really close and personal to you, and then have the author who asked you for that favor reject it or try to argue with you about your experience and not understand what a gift that is. But that is the other option if you're trying to write something that's a big stretch. So like, for example, if I were going to write something like The Baron, and probably I would know that this particular subject was just not in my wheelhouse. So I don't think I would. But if for some reason like I had a paid job or someone wanted me to write a story like this, I would be asking some real favors from my friends who are survivors of sexual assault to consult with me on the work that I'm doing in order to make sure that what I'm putting forward is not just accurate, but also not following into that 101 allyship hole of portraying something instead of critiquing it.
I once read an article that argued that there was no such thing as an anti-war movie. It said you can summon all your skill to devastate audiences with the horrors of war, and there's still going to be a bunch of guys who think it's cool and go straight to the Marine recruiting office. I like Stanley Kubrick, and a few years ago I watched some stuff about the making of Full Metal Jacket, and he's showing what the Vietnam War turned soldiers into. You've got a guy who, in the spring, he's in high school, going to prom, and in the fall, he's up in a helicopter, machine gunning women and children to death while screaming, "Get some!" And the comment sections are full of guys who think that this monster is cool, saying in all seriousness that, oh yeah, he was my role model when I went to Iraq.
Like, I remember notably Starship Troopers was that way. The book itself is very pro-war, and the movie they made based on Starship Troopers is very sarcastic and anti-war. but using the exact same material. It's kind of all in your point of view and who you are and whether you think this is glamorous or cool or just disgusting when you talk about recruiting for war and the military machine. But yeah, you're right that there's always a really big danger that you're going to just make the thing look cool. Kind of like Breaking Bad is actually probably one of the most relevant cultural touchstones because people treated Walter White as such a hero when that show was airing. And I'm not sure people understood that he was the villain of the series. I don't know if you remember, but the actress who played Walter White's wife received tons and tons of real life harassment because people hated her character because she was sort of like the nag who was trying to make her husband stop doing drugs. It's a series that to me is very much trying to critique Walter White and trying to critique the hubris that it took for him to fall into the world of crime that he does. But like the viewers, I think, thought it looked super great. like he's just a super cool, awesome, manly man doing the drugs and making tons of money. And that's the danger, right? It just requires a lot of skill to pull it off correctly. And even then, you're going to have people who don't understand what you're doing with it.
Yeah, and the thing is that even if you do understand, it can still be a hard trap to escape. To go to something a lot more obscure than Breaking Bad, a few years ago, Warren Ellis did a comic called Karnak that Ellis himself said was supposed to be about an absolute trash fire of a human being. Definitely one of your anti-heroes. And I recognize the intent, but it's still so hard for me not to treat Karnak as an aspirational figure. I guess that ultimately what it comes down to is that he's a trash fire of a human being in a way that really struck a chord with me. It's the same way that I'm a trash fire of a human being, but he's so much cooler about it.
Hashtag life goals.
Yeah, but all that said, I don't think the guy from The Baron is going to be attractive to anyone. Even apart from the fact that he's raping his daughter, there's just nothing at all appealing about him.
Right. There were some great little character building details to discover all along. If you examine the winter coat that your character is wearing when he sets off into the forest, you get this. It says, "You bought this winter coat recently, after much urging by your wife. True, there were holes in your old one, and it wasn't half as warm, but it was familiar. It was your winter coat, but women don't understand that sort of thing." And I was like, wow, that tells me a whole lot about this character. Just the rank misogyny present there. And then the other one I loved at the beginning for certain values of love was in the very first scene when you wake up in this character's room, his wife's asleep there, and I typed kiss wife. And the wife flinches away from you when you do that, and it reveals that she's only pretending to be asleep. And at first I thought, oh man, like maybe this guy beats his wife or something. And that was my first thought of what I thought the game was going to be about. But it was definitely a moment where you realize something's deeply wrong. There was this period of time around the mid to late aughts where a lot of storytelling revolved around anti-heroes and unlikable protagonists that were sort of recast as heroes, and dozens and dozens and dozens of examples across TV and books. But like some of the most famous ones would be Dexter, which was the serial killer who fights crime. There was also Breaking Bad, of course. And then in games, I really remember Braid being very notable. I think it was in the early days when indie games were starting to be able to be released on major consoles. And so it went really big. And Braid is a game where it starts off as you're playing as a hero who's rescuing the princess who's been kidnapped. And then by the end of the game, you realize that you're actually playing as a stalker who will not let go of his ex-girlfriend or some girl he knows. And so that has a very similar pattern to what we see in The Baron, which was written around the same time period. And I remember at the time that these stories were just everywhere. It was like everyone wanted to tell the story where it's like, what if evil guys were complex? And let's do the character study of the psychopath and evil guys and drug dealers. And they were all over the place. And it's really interesting because at this point in time, the pendulum has swung back the other way. I'm noticing a big trend in media where there's like cozy stories and gentle stories and kind stories are kind of in. So if like you're a fan of Ted Lasso, that might be a great example. If anyone out there is a fan of like fantasy novels, The Goblin Emperor has a kindness motif. Legends and Lattes. What if your Dungeons and Dragons barbarian orc retired and opened a coffee shop? That one's starting to be nominated for a lot of awards. It came out last year. And a lot of this, I think, relates to the fact that, you know, we all just lived through the COVID years. And if you're here in the United States, through the Trump years. And generally speaking, I think it's much easier to enjoy anti-heroes and stories about really bad people when you're not like living under one. And then when we all started having to deal with Trump, it just became way less fun to watch that kind of character on TV or read it in books. And so the pendulum swung back towards more cozy stories and gentle stories because that was the escapism we wanted at that time. And I think The Baron exists in that tradition too. So you've got the character study of a man who's molesting his daughter, and let's get really into his head and try to think about how he sees the world, and very of its time and very, I think in some ways, hard to see in the same way that it may have been received back then, because I think that it was part of a conversation that was happening across many forms of writing and exists in that context. And in the current one, to me, it kind of rings a much more sour note compared to how it felt in its time.
That's a really interesting observation to me because it dovetails with what I studied back in college. Berkeley was the center of the New Historicism movement, and I remember my little mind being blown by the idea that, hey, if you're watching a Western made in the 1970s, that movie might be telling you more about the 1970s than it is about the actual Old West.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes.
So I'm fascinated by the way that stories reflect the times in which they're written, as opposed to the times in which they're set. The Baron initially purports to be set in faux medieval times, and then it turns out to really be set I was about to say that it was set in like the late 19th, early 20th century because photography's around, but I guess it could be set in the present. It just didn't feel modern to me somehow, and I'm not sure why.
You know, that is something I still struggle with. If this is a historical piece that's legit supposed to be set in like medieval times or in an early industrial era, that makes the situation different. That makes sense. Like the whole conundrum of this man who is sexually assaulting his daughter and, you know, maybe understanding how families worked back then and how much more dependent his wife and child would be on him. That's sort of why I thought about it a whole lot. What options does his wife and his daughter really have outside of him? And like, is that supposed to be the backdrop for why this is such a struggle for him? I think it's meant to be, this is all in this guy's head, and it probably does take place in the present, but I was intrigued by the idea that this game could be deliberately set in an era where these questions are more complicated because of the options that his family has or doesn't have without him.
It does feel like it makes a difference somehow, whether we're in the year 2006 or 1906 or 1206.
Yes, absolutely.
But regardless of when it's set, you're absolutely right that it's going to be inflected by the cultural moment of 2006. But where my mind went as I played through The Baron and started to gather what it was really about is that there's an even clearer forebear of this player character from before the Sopranos, Dexter, Breaking Bad, villain as main character era, which is Humbert Humbert from Lolita. Obviously, Lolita is going to be brought up pretty much any time child sexual abuse comes up in a narrative. But on top of that, that book was an exercise in Nabokov trying for the ultimate degree of difficulty by using a child rapist as a viewpoint character and exploring his self-justification. The book is about a guy desperately trying to recast his despoiling of a young girl's life as a sort of intellectual game of the sort that we see in Nabokov's other novels. And meanwhile, Nabokov himself gives us little hints of the true horror underlying this intellectual game and makes that horror visible through the cracks. So the fact that The Baron was also about a child rapist exploring his own self-justification, it seemed to me that there was more than the usual amount of overlap there.
It reminds me a little bit of a really difficult writing exercise that a writing instructor of mine used to give, which was that, you know, at some point in your career, you should try to think of the person you like the least in the world or whoever you find to be least sympathetic and attempt to write their point of view. And Nabokov being a genius, yeah, it's such a great novel. And yeah, it's interesting how far ahead of its time it was in terms of like the trend of anti-heroes and gross people as point of view characters just being a thing and being something that people wanted to read. And I mean, there's a reason why Lolita is always on those banned book lists. Very challenging in its time, especially even more so than The Baron is in our time for that exact reason. It's really clear to me that his intentions are good when I play the game. Like, it's not supposed to be a game that's glorifying this person. And it's pretty clear from really early on that this is meant to be a critique of this person, of this character you're playing as. And you've also now answered a question I had through email. How does a game get nominated for these awards? What's that process like? What I was sort of asking indirectly was, who nominated this? There's some awards that are voted on by juries. There's some that are picked by fans. And like the composition of that pool can often tell you what that audience is going to think is award worthy or interesting. So I was wondering whether or not at the time that the Baron was released, if the composition of the community was skewed more towards people who would consider this game to be groundbreaking and different versus just kind of like, okay, there's another antihero.
Well, there had been plenty of evil player characters in IF by 2006. Again, I had a child rapist as a player character 6 years earlier in Shrapnel. Primo Varicella is obviously not a pleasant fellow. Going all the way back to 1983, you had Infidel by Infocom. But since you brought up the awards the Baron won, I forgot to mention these before, so to catch up, it won 2. It won the Spring Thing for 2006, though it only had 3 competitors, so maybe a little different from winning the Fall Comp, which had 43 games. It also won the Zizzy Award for Best Use of Medium. And that's always going to be a weird one to look at in retrospect. I see this in reviews all the time. How could anyone think this was groundbreaking? It's so basic. Well, the reason it seems basic to you is that it was so groundbreaking that everyone copied it. Like, people read The Catcher in the Rye and they ask, why did anyone ever make such a big deal out of this book? Every teenage narrator sounds like this. But the reason every teenage narrator sounds like this is that all the authors are copying The Catcher in the Rye.
It's because it did it first. It's hard to have that context for how groundbreaking a thing can be in its time and how fresh it can feel the first time someone does it.
Now, one of the things that I try to impress upon my students is that at the core of a story, you have a narrator speaking to a narratee. In The Catcher in the Rye, it's Holden Caulfield speaking to his psychiatrist. And behind that narrator is the implied author. As a reader, you can't access the real author directly, but you can imagine the intelligence behind the work. So, say Holden's relating a conversation in which Holden comes off as embarrassingly immature, but he doesn't realize it. You don't have to know anything about J.D. Salinger, but you'll still have a sense of an author figure engineering that scene so that we will have a different sense of how the conversation went than Holden does. And any classroom unit about unreliable narrators is probably going to touch on this distinction between narrator and implied author one way or another. What I emphasize in my classes is that it also works the other way. Authors don't know who will read their stories. But when you write something, you can't help but have an implied reader. It could be really narrow, like I'm writing for the 50 people on the IF news groups. Or it could be a lot wider, like adults in the Western world in the 21st century. Those are my implied readers. But even that leaves out a lot of people. So when you read something, or in this case, play something, I find it really interesting to ask, who's the implied reader here? Because it may not be you.
Right, yeah. So I did wonder, after playing this, who the story was intended for, because of the fact that it wasn't telling me anything shocking or new. And part of this might just relate to my day job, working in special education. It's a population where children are much more vulnerable to sexual assault and to being molested than, maybe children who don't have disabilities. And so I just know from my job that what this story is portraying is actually super common, depressingly common. It's common for a lot of children to be molested by a relative that's within their family. And so when you treat that as the punchline of a story, it made me wonder, who is the story for? Because, it's kind of obvious to me. And it isn't really saying anything new. I know that people like the Baron or this main character are narcissists who are going through the self-justification in their head. They don't really want to give up what they're doing. And in fact, there's a little bit in the game where this comes across. So at one point, you're having a conversation with this gargoyle. And the gargoyle's story is that by day, the gargoyle's made of stone and can't act or do much other than sit there. And at nighttime, the gargoyle turns into flesh and blood. But at some point, by the end of the night, the gargoyle has to go and suck all the joy out of one person before he turns into stone again. And then he spends all day regretting what he did and wondering whether or not he should do this again. And was it really worth being alive for the night to do this? And then by nightfall, then he turns into flesh again and his cycle repeats. And it's supposed to be sort of like an analog to what this main character is doing to his daughter. But what really bothered me about it was just the fact that, like, I'm like, well, the gargoyle literally turns to stone. And this guy doesn't turn to stone during the day. So to me, it sounds an awful lot like that he's enjoying his life and just doesn't want to give that up. Anyway, so long story short, I wondered who this was for because like none of that was very new to me. When I say that these experiences are really common, I think what's often shocking to people is that victims of sexual crimes in particular actually do a lot of work to manage other people's feelings. So, for example, I remember when the Me Too movement was all over social media, and I really vividly remember some of my close male friends being aghast at how universal the experience of sexual harassment was for pretty much any woman over the age of 12. And then I realized after talking with them, and I think this relates to the Baron, there's this thing that men and boys do where they tell their female friends and relatives, anyone ever hurt you, I've got your back. I will grab a chainsaw and go take that person apart limb by limb. If anyone ever hurts you, I will go beat them to a bloody pulp or something. And it's sort of meant, I think, to be supportive. Like, hey, don't worry if one of those bad guys out there ever finds you, you can come to me and I'll help you. But I vividly remember being a girl, like probably around the same age as the girl in the story, and like hearing that message from my dad or maybe someone else, other like male relative, and it hitting me like the lightning bolt that it was my job to make sure my dad or my uncle or whoever would never get set off that way. I'm like, oh no, like if I ever have one of these experiences, like not only will I like have this experience that's horrible, but my dad might fly off the handle and go murder somebody and then go to jail. And like, oh no, my dad will be gone. So that basically you sort of learn that it's your job to protect men and boys from this stuff. And so you just don't talk about it when it happens to them. Instead, you go and you talk about it to your gal pals and they'll understand. And if you tell the boys, they tend to overreact and get really upset and not really wait to see what it is that you need for them or ask what you need. In fact, I remember reading a long time ago about a guy who was working at a rape crisis center and him realizing that when these college-age girls would experience rape and go to the crisis center, the first thing they would say is, oh my gosh, please don't tell my dad. My dad's going to be so mad. Like their immediate reaction was to be afraid of what their dad would say, not because they didn't think their dad didn't love them, but because of the Baron metaphor that I'm going to go grab my axe and go off in the night and kill the Baron. So you end up with this culture of silence. So like men go through their entire lives thinking this stuff is more rare than it really is. And I almost wonder if maybe they're the audience that the Baron is intended for.
Yeah, given that some form of sexual harassment is a nearly universal female experience and sexual abuse is much more common than has historically been acknowledged, you're right that a message that sexual harassment and abuse exist and are big problems may not be particularly edifying to women. So that's a huge chunk of the audience saying, yes, I have lived this my entire adult and adolescent and pre-adolescent life. You're not really telling me anything.
I also want to acknowledge that men and boys who are survivors of sexual assault or childhood sexual abuse are doubly impacted by the same culture of silence, because not only are they dealing with all the same things that women are in terms of like the stigma around this crime, but they might lack access to a support group the way that women often do, and the ability to talk about it and share their experiences and process that.
Worth noting. And by that token, I don't mean to paint any demographic group with a broad brush. When I get to the second group, there's a big segment of the audience for this or any other work that the ideas are just going to bounce off, who for one reason or another are just not going to listen. But then there is that group in between that actually can learn. A lot of the stuff you're bringing up is stuff that I have learned, but that I learned embarrassingly late in life. Take the street harassment. I remember playing an indie game back in the day. It was like a Doom parody, in which you play a woman walking down a city street, and every couple of steps you get blocked by guys catcalling you or telling you to smile or whatnot. And when I played this, I had nothing to connect this to. I grew up in Orange County where people didn't walk down the street. From cartoons, I knew the stereotype of women getting catcalled as they walk past construction sites, But my takeaway was, wow, life was tough for women walking around in New York in the 1940s. So I thought this game was exaggerating in order to bring attention to an occasional problem. I remember thinking what a nightmare it would be if the world actually were like that. I didn't realize that the programmer was serious. Not until years later, when I not only had a girlfriend, but had a girlfriend who did live in a city and didn't drive, and I finally saw that she couldn't walk outside without living through that game, that it was basically a documentary. I mean, every day getting shouted at from cars.
Yeah.
What is that?
I know. It's like, do you know him? No. It just happens sometimes.
And this was in a genteel Canadian town, supposedly a more polite society, with me around.
That's the mild version. Exactly. I mean, I am nodding so hard it hurts. It blows my mind, but you're right. There's very good reasons for why men can grow up not seeing it so much, because either it's not happening because you're there, or it's happening somewhere where you don't see. And so then you have that entire thing where, as a woman, you find yourself arguing with men over whether or not sexual harassment is really a problem or not. And that gets weird too, where it's kind of like, why would I lie to you, bro? Like, I'm not making this up for fun.
And it was just in the past few years that my current girlfriend laid out for me the sort of stuff you were talking about vis-a-vis the culture of silence. I mean, I'm sure my previous girlfriends did as well, but this is when I finally started to process it. But yeah, the way that from a very early age, girls are socialized to manage the way that boys are socialized, while the reverse is not true. Girls learn that before they say anything or do anything, they have to mentally game out how are the men and boys around me going to react, and how do I preempt those reactions, and how do I prepare a salve for those reactions, and they basically just have to live life as a chess game, always thinking 3 moves ahead, because in a lot of cases, there is real danger in not doing so. And I'm sure I still don't appreciate this as fully as I should. But I feel like I do appreciate it more than I did even earlier in my adult life, let alone as an adolescent or as a kid. So learning is a thing that can happen. A while back when I was applying for teaching jobs, I found a listing for a very prestigious school that a friend of mine had gone to back in the day. It was one of the very few secular all-girls high schools in this country. And I thought, hey, maybe I should apply to this one, because if I want to work towards a more sexually equitable society, why not leverage what teaching skills I do possess toward helping girls outcompete all of the future Brett Kavanaughs of the world? And my girlfriend said, no, don't do that. And I asked why, and she said, because if you want to be an ally to women and promote sexual equity, then your audience is boys.
Yes.
Specifically, boys who are not going to listen to these ideas when they come from a woman.
Yes.
They've probably already heard these ideas 1,000,000 times from their female teachers, but they need to hear them and see them being accepted and promoted by a dude.
Exactly. Yes. You're a very smart girlfriend. Yeah.
And on a related note, the first IF game I released back at the beginning of 1997 was called IO, or Interstate Zero. I have since taken my name off it. I've seen a fair amount of speculation online as to why, but no one has actually, asked me. But in any case, the short version is this. I wrote it as a way to learn in form. I just went chapter by chapter through the manual and added stuff. So it's not a real game. It's a training exercise. And all the hobbyist IF I'd encountered seemed to have been written by erudite British professors. So as a knee-jerk reaction, I decided to go for something American and trashy and make it a parody of late-night Cinemax shows. But as I was throwing it together, I started to think, hey, I'm looking at the audience for these games, and at least judging by the IF news groups, they're over 90% male. So this could be an opportunity to do a little bit of a honey trap. Present a female player character who initially seems like typical Cinemax wish fulfillment, but then gradually get the players to genuinely identify with her rather than seeing her as a plaything. Show the players the handprint she put in the cement of her patio when she was 3, that sort of thing. Now, this is absolutely one of those reach exceeds the grasp situations we were talking about before. The game did make a little bit of a splash because there were more plot branches than hobbyist game tended to have in 1997, and because there were custom responses to more commands than players were used to getting. But to give you a sense of where we were in 1997, at the time, all animate entities in the Inform language were assumed male by default. You could assign them the property female, but in the Inform code, the term female was actually an alias for the attribute absent. There was a comment in the library file next to that line saying, "Please, no psychoanalysis." So my goal was to take the sort of guys who would write code like that and maneuver them into switching up their subject position and accepting a female character as self. And like I said, I don't think I pulled it off. But I was happy to see that the female posters to the newsgroups in 1997, because there were some, and they did see what I was going for and wrote enthusiastic things about the game. And these were not just people posting under female names on the internet. These were women I did end up meeting in real life. But here's the point. I was trying, in a hubristic way, to do a little consciousness racing for a community of male geeks in 1997. That's the audience for the game. Those were my implied readers. But as hard as it is for me to accept, 1997 was a long time ago. And that audience doesn't exist anymore. So the game probably shouldn't exist anymore either, except as something for historians to poke at. It's like a political speech from 1887. As a historical document, you can make of it what you will, but the candidate isn't trying to get your vote, just like candidates today aren't trying to get the votes of people in the year 2200. So this brings me back to the question of what sort of audience Victor Heispers might have been aiming at in 2006. I don't know whether there was the same sense then of, oh, I'm writing for the 50 people I see posting on the news groups, or a little bit later, I'm writing for my 50 friends that I hang out with every day on IFMUD. There might have been more of a sense of casting the game out to the anonymous masses. And I also wonder this. Victor Heispers is a philosophy professor, and the game does seem to be primarily interested in the player character's philosophical outlook toward what he's doing, as shaped by the player's choices. It's about questions of guilt and responsibility and whether cycles of abuse can be broken and whatnot. And I wonder whether the audience is going to divide up into those with enough distance from the topic to feel comfortable approaching it as something one can philosophize about, and, on the other hand, those who say, yeah, maybe you don't get to step back and be an ivory tower academic dispassionately analyzing a 12-year-old girl getting raped by her father.
So I think another way that, for me, the game showed its age was the fact that it had a warning that you could read beforehand that the content was going to be intense, but it didn't tell you specifically what the game contained. And I was surprised that there wasn't the option to view a more explicit warning, because I think nowadays that would be expected in a game like this, to include a content warning that there was child sexual assault in the game.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing that really makes me feel like I'm a creature of the past. Because you're looking at this 2006 game from the perspective of 2023 and asking, why aren't there more detailed content warnings on this? And I'm looking at 2023 from the perspective of the 20th century and asking why there are detailed content warnings on everything these days. Because I have noticed this trend in online archives of games and fanfic and videos and things where everything gets loaded with like 500 different tags, minutely detailing every bit of content in the story. Like hashtag grapefruit, so you can avoid stories in which someone eats a grapefruit. Or search for them if you're into that sort of thing. And as an unfrozen caveman, this mystifies me because I've seen people complaining that, for example, I started reading this story and it turned out that the main guy's wife is cheating on him. And there was no tag warning me of that. I wouldn't have started this story if I knew there was adultery in it. And my reaction's always, whatever happened to surprise? How is the author supposed to shock you with this revelation if you already knew about it from the tags? Like, I remember Roger Ebert and other film critics writing around the turn of the millennium to ask, why are movie trailers now showing the endings of the movies? But apparently the answer is that that's what a lot of the 21st century audience wants. People want to know exactly what am I getting into before I invest my time and possibly even my money in this. And for me, it's doubly strange because I go in the opposite direction. I feel like it's pretty normal that if you recommend a movie to someone, the usual response is going to be, oh, cool, what's it about? Whereas if someone tells me, oh, you should watch this movie, it's about, I just stop and say, no, stop. If you want me to watch it, I'll watch it, but don't tell me anything about it. I want to be completely surprised. I just want to know the title and that it was recommended. I don't want to know who wrote it. I don't want to know who directed it, who's in it, and certainly I don't want to know the premise. So the idea that people want a full accounting of what's in the story is alien to me. Now, I do understand the idea of trigger warnings. And especially with The Body Keeps the Score being the big bestseller that it is, I think a lot more people understand trigger warnings better than they did a few years ago. But I feel as though these warnings go beyond that. I feel like nowadays people are more explicit about approaching stories not as art, but as commodities. Like, I'm in the market for precisely this set of experiences, and I don't want any experiences that I didn't explicitly choose. People want to order up the emotions a story will evoke the same way they'd order toppings on a pizza.
So first of all, just for anyone listening who might not know the difference, I'd like to define, as I understand it, the difference between a trigger warning and a content warning. And I come from the world of disability, so the way I view this topic is very much of that angle. And a trigger warning is intended for a person who has PTSD over some specific common traumatic experience to have the option to participate safely in communities where they already belong. So, for example, if you are a hardcore horror movie fan and you just can't get enough of Hellraiser and Scream or whatever, and then one day you were raped. But just because you're raped doesn't mean that you want to give up all of your hardcore horror movies. You just need a heads up about the one thing that you experienced, maybe being in them, so you can decide if you're in a space where you're able to engage with the content that you already love. So, there's a misunderstanding that people think that sometimes trigger warnings are meant for people who just don't like a thing to avoid it. But trigger warnings in particular, the intention behind them is to support people who are already in your community to be able to engage as they choose to. Kind of like putting a wheelchair ramp into a theater. That way, maybe before you lost your ability to walk to enter the theater easily, now you need a little support to get in there. And it helps a lot. It hurts no one in the community for you to have a heads up. And it just is a way for your community to continue to make sure you're included. Content warnings are broader. So a content warning is just what it sounds like. It's a heads up that there is content of some sort in the thing that you're going to experience. And it can include those really common experiences that can create PTSD, like rape or childhood sexual abuse or suicide attempts. Like there's lots of things like that kind of fall under the trigger warning umbrella. But content warnings could also include things like you pointed out, like, maybe a person doesn't want to read stuff where the guy cheats on his wife, or you don't want to read something where there's animal harm. It's more about your personal sensitivities and just a thing you don't like versus it being something where the community is trying to find a way to include you in a thing that you already love. So I think that there's a lot of debate over whether they're actually useful or not. So even with trigger warnings, I think research has shown that it isn't necessarily treating PTSD. So your PTSD doesn't necessarily get better by avoiding things that are triggers for you. But the counter to that would also be that it's not true exposure therapy to surprise a person with something that's upsetting for them. You're not going to cure someone's PTSD by jumping out of a closet and throwing the thing at them that scares them. That should be done with consent and with the guidance of a licensed therapist that you've chosen to work with. Content warnings, there's a lot of room for debate there about whether or not they're a good thing or, like you said, more of a product of the commodification of media. I think that there's a lot of room in that area for smart people to have very different opinions.
Yeah, I just keep going back to the question of how to balance these accommodations with the ability to write an effective story. For instance, you mentioned suicide. I've written stories in which characters commit suicide. In one in particular that I'm thinking of, it's supposed to be like a thunderbolt that just knocks the wind out of you. And it feels like it would completely undermine the story to say up front, hey everyone, someone in the story commits suicide partway through, because then everyone's going to be braced for it. They'll spend the whole story looking for signs and wondering, is it this character? Is it that character? Is it this chapter? Is it that chapter? Assuming they don't demand to know which character in advance and which chapter in advance. Maybe leaving those things up in the air isn't enough of a warning.
I'm kind of the opinion that, you know what, it's not my job to choose what a person wants in their media. There are people who are adventurous, who are up for anything, that like to be surprised. There are people out there who want to go read their John Grisham novels and read the exact same one over and over and over again until the day they die, and that makes them happy. And like, I'm sure Netflix and the streaming services contribute to that tagging and being able to find exactly what experience you're looking for. And, you know, I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing. It's just kind of, I guess, what it is right now. Speaking about content warnings in particular and about the Baron, the reason I would expect a game like this to have a tag today is because it does fall into the category of maybe more the trigger warning side of things, where, like, you know, it's discussing an experience that's extremely common. So like I said, childhood sexual abuse is more common than we think it is. There's a lot of these people out there. Every one of us probably knows someone who has had this experience. I do know for a fact there are people in my life who've dealt with this. And if you don't know who they are, it's probably because you don't know them well enough, or they don't trust you enough, or whoever knows why maybe they don't want to talk about it. The point being is that you should assume you already know these people. They're already in your life. And I remember years and years ago, I got some rape crisis training back when I was a resident assistant in the dorms back in college. And one thing that really stayed with me from that training was the fact that when you're working with people who have dealt with sexual assault in particular, the very first thing you do to help them heal, like even as soon as it happens, is you try to give their power back to them, because it is a crime that isn't just a physical assault. It's an assault on your agency. So someone has used your personal body like an object rather than like a person, and your control is taken from you, despite what your wishes were. And so immediately when you deal with someone who's had this experience, you should give them choices. You should say, can I sit down? Do you want a hug? Do you want to go to the hospital? Is there someone I can call? Give them choices, like make no assumptions, and make sure that you're giving them their power back and their ability to control their world any way you can. And so maybe for me, I think it's especially appropriate that when you're dealing with this sort of content that applies to this group of people in the world, anything we can do to give them control back over their world is supportive and is something that harms no one. If you were building an interactive fiction game today and you have content like this, maybe the way I would do it is I would just put it like just in your little start menu. You can say, if you want to view optional content warnings, you can go down to tab 6 or something and find it. And then people can ignore if they want to. If you just happen to be the kind of person who is a member of this community, but just knows that you might need a heads up on a thing, then you have the option to go and look if you want it. But I think we do so little in our society to accommodate people with PTSD. Speaking really broadly of disability, I've noticed that we as a society tend to view disability as a personal failing. We don't articulate that directly. Like, you don't see a person with like a broken arm and say that person deserved it somehow, but we do it with a lot of other disabilities, especially with things that are invisible. So mental health issues like chronic fatigue syndrome, neurodivergence of all sorts. We kind of interpret the symptoms of these disorders as personal failings, and just sort of want people to be able to get over it somehow and cowboy up and push themselves through it and just somehow be better. And it bothers me. And maybe that's why when I think that we do so little for these people in our society to try to accommodate them and make them feel included, that content warnings and trigger warnings are just not a lot to ask. And whether or not they work or not, I like that it's something that we're trying. And it's better than, the absolute zero that we were doing before. And that is my long-winded explanation about why why I think that content warnings and trigger warnings have their place.
And this is the part where we run out of time for Ask Tell number 14. So to hear the end of this conversation, please continue on to number 15. See you there. I mean, not literally. I can't see you. And whenever you might be listening to this, I'm a voice from the past. But it seemed like the thing to say. Okay, bye for now.